Well, hey guys, and welcome to week 2 of our series, Taking Responsibility for Your Life. Now, my guess is that the first time you heard the title to our series and you heard us say, we're going to talk about taking responsibility for your life, you got pretty excited. And I'll tell you why you got excited. Because you know somebody who's not taking responsibility for their life. And you thought to yourself, boy, do they ever need to hear this series? I've got a spouse, I've got a family member, I got a kid, I've got a coworker, and they need to take responsibility. So you got excited and you were like, I'm going to go home and I'm going to go to Facebook and I'm going to post this and I'm going to share it with those people because they need to start taking responsibility for their life. And the reason that is true about us, the reason we tend to think that way, and we talked about this last week, is because irresponsibility in life is something that is so hard for us to see in the mirror. It's easy to see it in other people, but when it comes to ourselves, taking responsibility for our own lives, it's just hard for us to see that. Now, if you were here last week, you know we also learned a few things. We learned, first of all, about responsibility, that the truth is, you and I, all of us, were created to be responsible. And it doesn't really matter if you believe God created you or maybe you think it would just all happen by accident. You can't deny that there's something inside of you, there's something inside of me that craves responsibility. We're happiest when we have been given responsibility and when we're able to carry that responsibility out and do a good job with it. That's when we're happiest. I mean, just think about it. You know some people who've lost their job and it has just crushed their spirit. Maybe that's been you. And the reason it crushes your spirit is because we're made to be responsible for a task. And it devastates us when we aren't given a task or given a job and we can carry that job out and to do a great job with it. You were made to be responsible. And so last week, you remember if you were here, we looked at the story of Adam and Eve, and we talked about how God gave them huge responsibility. And in the very beginning, they handled it pretty well. In fact, we found out that when we're given responsibility and we're handling our responsibilities and we're doing what we're supposed to do, you don't need very many rules. In fact, Adam and Eve, we learned, only had one rule. And as long as they carried out their responsibility, as long as they held up their end of the deal, everything worked out fine. Rules became sort of irrelevant. And so you've seen this in your house. You've seen this in the way your family works. As long as everybody pulls their weight, as long as everybody does what they're supposed to do, there's not a whole lot of a concern for rule keeping because everybody's doing their part. We don't need a whole lot of rules. But now when people don't carry out their responsibility, that all changes. But things work out when we hold on to our responsibility. And then that leads us to the final point we learned last week, and it's this. Whenever you or when I become irresponsible, when we don't do our part, when we become irresponsible, our irresponsibility eventually will become somebody else's responsibility. See, when I drop the ball, it isn't just about me. And when you drop the ball, it isn't just about you because nobody lives in isolation. You don't either. We are all connected. And so when you drop the ball, your irresponsibility has to be picked up by somebody else. I mean, just think about it. If you don't wash the dishes, if it's your job to wash the dishes, those dishes don't wash themselves. In fact, you've heard your mom say that before to you, right? Those dishes won't wash themselves because when you don't do your job, somebody has to come behind you and they've got to wash those dishes. If you don't pay your bills, somebody has to come along behind you and pay them for you, or somebody's got to take the financial hit. If you're in the grocery aisle and you drop that jar of pickles, and you can look around all you want and make sure nobody saw you, and you can walk away and pretend that it didn't happen and you don't know anything about it. But the truth is, somebody's coming behind you with a broom or a mop to clean up your mess. If you don't take responsibility for the care and maintenance of your own body, you know, somebody's going to have to. See, a lot of times we pretend that it's my body, I can do what I want to with it. And so you smoke or you drink or you eat your way into a health problem. Well, at that point, it's not just you. Somebody else has got to come and take care of you because of the damage you did to your body. So your irresponsibility has now become somebody else's responsibility. And it always works that way, eventually. Now, today, I want to talk to you about something, and to get at what we're going to learn today, I want to start by taking you back to middle school, maybe your high school science class, and I want to teach you something. Now, this is not something I'm really teaching you. I'm probably just reminding you of this. You probably already learned it. Truth is, you just forgot it. It's a principle that I want to teach you today, and here it is. It's called Archimedes' principle, and I'll put a graphic up on the screen that kind of explains it. Archimedes' principle is the scientific principle that explains why some things sink and why some things float. It's the reason why rocks always sink and a battleship floats. And as you can see there on the graphic, the principle states specifically that the force of the water that pushes up on an object is equal to the weight of the water that the object displaces. Now, everybody got that? Okay, don't worry. I'm not going to give you a pop quiz at the end of this. You don't have to remember the specifics. There's a point I'm trying to make. Now, here's my point. Things had been sinking and floating for years, long before Archimedes ever came around and figured out this principle, right? So the truth is, he didn't invent this principle. He just discovered it. He figured out why it works, why some things float and why some things sink. And from that point in history, because he discovered it and figured it out and told us how it works, we were able to use that principle. And so from that point on, people could build large ships that could float in water. I mean, we even have cruise ships today that weigh thousands and thousands of tons, but they still float along the water. Now, this principle is not bad and it's not good. It just is. And that's the nature of all principles, and that's something you need to remember. It's just the way something works. And when it comes to principles in your life and in my life, well, we have a choice. We can either leverage the principle and use it to our advantage, or we can ignore the principle and pretend it doesn't exist and face the consequences of that principle. See, nobody believes that God is up in heaven just arbitrarily making decisions about what sinks and what floats, because there's a principle in place. It's not like God in every moment when somebody throws something in the water, he has to stop and go, okay, hang on, let me decide, is this going to float or is this going to sink? And he's just going around the world all the time saying, okay, float, sink, and float. He's not doing that arbitrarily. He's not just making that decision on the fly. God created a principle that works in the world. And if you obey the principle, that principle works every time. And it doesn't even matter if you believe in the principle or not. It's just the way it is. And just because a principle works, okay, and remember this, just because a principle works does not reflect anything about God's decision about you or about me or about anything. God just created the principle. And then he gives us the choice either to use the principle to our advantage or to ignore the principle and face the consequences. Now, today, leading all up to this, I want to talk to you about a different kind of principle. And this is something that you may have heard growing up. You've probably heard somebody say it in a certain way. And it's a principle that it's been running in the background of your life the whole time. Most of you don't think about it at all, if any. You don't pay very much attention to this principle. We all tend to kind of forget it. And I'll tell you why we forget it. Because it's not like Archimedes' principle. It's not one of those principles that just happens immediately. In fact, you don't often see the effects of this principle right away. Like, for instance, if you throw something in the water, you don't have to come back a month or 2 months later to see if it was sinking or floating. I mean, you know right away what's happening. So this principle that we're learning today, it's a little bit different. It's kind of like this. You remember the story Pinocchio when you were a kid? Pinocchio was one of my favorite stories growing up. You remember what happened in the story of Pinocchio every time he told a lie? Anybody remember? Yeah, his nose would grow. So every time he told a lie, his nose would get bigger. Now, imagine for a second that that's how it worked out for you. Every time you told a lie, your nose immediately would start growing out of your face. Question. If that were true about you, would you ever tell a lie? Probably not, or at least not very often. Because every single moment of your life, you would be thinking, now, is what I'm about to say truthful? Because if it's not truthful, I don't want to have my nose coming out of my head. In fact, you'd be seeing people around you every now and then with noses sticking out of their head, and you'd think, I don't want to be that person, so I'm not going to tell a lie. You'd think about every word that you spoke. The principle we're learning today is not like that. It's not immediate. It doesn't happen in the moment. You don't see the consequences. It sometimes takes years, it sometimes takes months, but it happens later. And that's why you don't think about the principle. That's why you forget about it. But the truth is, most of you know this principle. You've heard it before. Most of you didn't know that it came from the Bible, I'll bet, but it's in there. So what is the principle that we're learning today? Well, let's look at it. Here it is. The principle is this: people reap whatever they sow. People reap what they sow. And again, that's not new to you. You've probably heard that before. Somebody along the way, maybe your parents told you, you're going to reap what you sow. But this principle, it's just as true as Archimedes' principle. As sure as there are things that are going to sink, and as sure as there are things that are going to float, people tend to reap whatever they sow. This principle also explains that very important point we made just a second ago, why your irresponsibility always becomes somebody else's responsibility. It explains why you and I suffer consequences in the present for choices that I made in the past. It's because of this principle. It's why people say your past will always catch up with you, and it always does. It's because of this principle. And remember, principles are not good, principles are not bad. They just are. It just is what it is. Now, let me say something to some of you here today, because this is why you're here. This is the thing that you needed to hear when you came here today. Today's message is very good news for some of you, and I'll tell you why. Because some of you have been living your life, you've been walking around every single day with this thought. You think, God's mad at me. You look at the way your life has turned out, you look at the way things are going in your life, and you think, you know what? God doesn't love me. He's pretty mad at me right now. He doesn't care about what goes on in my life. He's against me, some of you have thought. And this principle will tell you, if you listen, that is not the case at all. God's not working against you. God's not mad at you. God has given us a principle in this world that we reap whatever we sow. And that principle has simply been working its way out in your life. And you didn't know it, maybe. Or you just sort of forgot about it and you didn't realize it. Or maybe you just ignored it. Maybe you just didn't leverage that principle earlier on in your life. And that's why your life has become the way your life is today. See, it's the same as Archimedes' principle. Just like God is not sitting up in heaven and deciding arbitrarily what sinks and what floats, God is also not arbitrarily sitting up in heaven deciding who gets blessed and who doesn't. God has given you a principle. We can choose to use it or we can ignore it. Now, I want to read to you today one of the places in the Bible that teaches us about this principle of reaping and sowing and reaping. And it's in the book of Galatians in the New Testament. Actually, Galatians is not a book. It's actually a letter. It's a letter written by the Apostle Paul to a group of Christians in a Roman province called Galatia. So if you want to follow along with us, go ahead and open your Bible to Galatians chapter 6. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's okay. We always put the verses on the screen. If you don't own a Bible, man, we would love to give you one today. On your way out, just stop by the information table. We'll give you one for free, no questions asked. If you've got your phone on you today, you can download the Bible app and have every version of the Bible right there on your phone. Or if you have the Community Christian Church app, you can just click the Bible button. And if you do that today, your app will just open up Galatians chapter 6 right there on your phone. It's like magic. So find that if you want, or just follow along on the screen. Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to start reading in verse 3. He says, if anyone thinks they're something when they're not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. Now, let me tell you how this applies to the topic of responsibility. Paul says it is so easy for you and me to deceive ourselves as long as we're comparing ourselves to people around us. And when I do that, I'm being self-deceptive. And when I'm self-deceptive, it's easier for me to be irresponsible. I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I look to my right and I see somebody who's not doing as well in life as me. They're having struggles that I'm not having, and I'm doing okay compared to them, and I see what their life is like. And I think to myself, well, I know I'm not everything that I wanted to be. I'm not perfect, but at least I'm not that bad. At least I don't have it as bad as her. At least I don't have the situation that he's in. And when we think that about ourselves, here's the tendency. Our tendency is to think, well, I can cut myself a little bit of slack. I can sort of let up a little bit. I can relax a little bit. Why am I being so hard on myself? And when we say that, we are always tempted to slip on our responsibilities. See, I've deceived myself into thinking, in Paul's words, that I'm better than what I am. In fact, Paul puts it this way. He says, I think I'm something when I'm not. And because I compare myself to someone else and I find myself to be better than them, I give myself excuses to be irresponsible with my life. Now, on the other hand, let's say I look over on the other side of me and I see somebody who's doing better than I'm doing. They have things that I wished I had, or they have a situation that I wish I was in. In those moments, I can look at that person and I can say to myself, well, if I had what he had, I'd be better. Or if I had kids like she has, I'd be better. If I had her looks, or if I had her husband, or if I had his job, I'd be like that. But I don't. And the temptation is this. Whenever we do that, the temptation is I begin to make excuses for why I am the way I am and why I'm not as responsible, and it gives me one more excuse to not be responsible with my life. See, this is why Paul says we ought to take pride in ourselves alone in that verse. See what he says? He said, take pride in yourself alone. Now, let me explain that. Paul's not talking about a bad kind of pride, because there is a kind of pride that can be sinful. It leads us to sin. That's not what he's talking about here. Paul's talking about being satisfied. Paul's talking about being happy within yourself. He says, I ought to be and you ought to be happy or satisfied with ourselves alone, because when I'm not and I begin to compare myself to other people, I start making excuses for myself. And if I compare myself to me, I'll start making progress. I'll start taking responsibility. But if I'm always comparing myself to another person, I'm making excuses, which leads me away from responsibility. But if I compare myself to me, I stop making excuses and I take responsibility for myself. And that's when I make progress. You see how that works? So Paul begins to make the application. Look at the next verse, verse 5. He says, each one of us should carry our own load. In other words, he's saying, look, you got responsibilities in your life. So do I. If you're a student here today, you have responsibilities. You have a responsibility to your school. You have a responsibility to your teachers. You have a responsibility to your parents, to your siblings, to your friends. And that's the load that you ought to carry. That's yours. Adults, we have responsibility for our families, our jobs, our employers, our spouses, our community. We have financial responsibilities. We should carry that load because it belongs to us. But as long as you compare yourself to the person next to you or the person on the other side of you, when you take your eyes and your attention off of your responsibility, you miss it. Because see, if I'm doing better than her, well, I don't need to work as hard as her, or work as hard as I do, because at least I'm not a loser like her. And if he's doing better than me, then it must be because something got handed to him. He had an advantage that I didn't have, so what's the point in working harder? Why should I take responsibility? You see how that works? See, the comparison game always moves us farther and farther and farther away from taking responsibility for our own lives. That's why Paul says we all need to carry our own load. We need to take responsibility for what we've been given. Don't look at what she's doing. Don't look at what he's doing. You carry your own load. That's their load to carry. It's not yours. You focus on yours. You've got your own, so you carry that. Forget about comparing yourself to the people around you and how they're doing. Then look at verse 7. Paul just starts to hammer home on this whole deal. Look at what he says. He says, do not be deceived, because God cannot be mocked. In other words, what Paul says here is, God's not like your mama. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Remember when you were a teenager, or maybe when you were younger or whatever, and you had that moment and you called up your mom and you said, look, Mom, I don't know how it happened. It wasn't my intention. I mean, I had no idea there was going to be beer at that party. I thought it was going to be a nice clean kind of affair. I didn't know it was going to be that bad, Mom. I showed up with good intentions. I was hanging out with my friends, and lo and behold, the police showed up, and they dragged me down here. And your mama said, don't worry about it, honey. We will come down there, and we will bail you out, right? Or maybe one day you said to your dad, Dad, I don't have a clue how this happened. I don't know where it happened. The account just wound up at zero. I mean, last week there was all kinds of money in that account. It must be the bank, Dad. They must have made a calculation error. It wasn't my fault because I know I had money in that account, and I don't know what happened. There must be a mistake. Well, don't worry, son. We will send you some more money. We will put money back into that account. Or Mom, I had no idea that we were having a test. Teacher didn't tell me. Besides, she barely even teaches. I know she didn't teach us anything about that chapter, and you know she's got it out for me, Mom. You know that teacher doesn't like me. Well, don't you worry about it, honey. I'll come down to that school, and I'll straighten that teacher right out. And you went home, and you got on the phone, and you called your buddies, and you said, my Mom, my Dad, I can't believe it. They're so gullible. They believe the story. Paul says, God ain't like that. God's not like your mom. God's not like your dad. There probably have been times in your past and in my past, there may be even times in our present right now where we can be irresponsible and we can get away with it, or we can talk our way or reason our way out of it. Paul says, not with God. God's not stupid. Now, we treat God like he's stupid sometimes, don't we? In fact, we even do this even in our religious systems sometimes. I mean, think about it. This is so silly. Some of us grew up in religious systems where we believed, and we acted this way, I can go out during the week and I can do whatever I want to do. I can live however I want to live. And as long as I get to church on Sunday, as long as I pray the prayer, as long as I say I'm sorry, then everything will be fine, and God will just forget the whole thing. It'll be like, he just forgets about my sin. Or maybe you had a tradition where you could just show up at church on Sunday, go sit in a booth with a priest, and just take your sin bucket and just get it emptied all out, and then go right back out the door and fill that sin bucket up again until next Sunday. And God will just forget about it. He won't even know what you're talking about when you get back and you dump it all out again. Now, hang on just a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, now wait a minute. I thought you always told us that God was a forgiving God. I thought you always said that God loves you unconditionally. And yes, that is true. You're right. That is all true. He is and he does. But think about it this way. When my kids do wrong, do I forgive my kids for what they've done? Of course I do. When my kids do wrong, when they make a mess of things, do I stop loving them because they make a mess of things? Of course I don't. Never. When my kids do wrong, do I immediately just start treating them differently and stop talking to them and never have a relationship with them again? No, I don't do that. But when my kids do wrong, do I remember it? Of course I do. And do I deal with their sin? In other words, do I allow them to face consequences for the sins that they've done? Of course I do. You bet I do. And listen to me, God is a much better father than I will ever be. I am constantly trying to be a perfect dad. I'll never be perfect, but God is. He already is perfect. He is perfect in his love. He is perfect in his forgiveness, but he is also perfect in his memory, and he is also perfect in his judgment. And my kids, they have the ability to pull a fast one on me. My kids can pull the wool over my eyes. They can manipulate my love. They can manipulate my forgiveness if they want. But you will never pull one over on your Heavenly Father, not once. I mean, there's never been a moment in your life where God said, well, boy, you got me on that one, man. You are so sneaky, I'm going to have to keep my eye on you. No, God's never said that. Look at what Paul says next. He says, do not deceive yourself. God will not be mocked. And here's the principle. He says, a man reaps whatever he sows. Now, to a degree, we all know this is true. We just forget it. And we live like it's not true. But you know this is right. Your life is connected. So is mine. You know this, right? Where you are today, where I am today, is a result of the decisions that I've made and the things that I've done in my past. Your life, where you are today, is a sum total of the things that you've done in the past and the decisions that you've made in the past. You know this is true. Where you'll be tomorrow is a direct result of the decisions you make and the things that you do today. You know that's all connected. There's a relationship between your current irresponsibility, in other words, the bad things you're doing today or the good things you've decided not to do. There's a correlation. They are related to what you can expect to be your life in the future down the road. Now, here's the part that we all assume, and I don't know where this came from, but I want you to notice something about the principle. You reap what you sow. Notice what the principle does not say. The principle does not say you will reap what you sow unless you ask for forgiveness. The principle doesn't say you will reap what you sow unless you start coming to church, unless you start doing good deeds, unless you give God a bunch of money. Doesn't say that. But see, a lot of us wind up saying things like this, and we think this way. We think, here I am, I'm living a good life, I'm doing things right, I'm coming to church, I'm serving, I'm doing my best, I'm doing the best I can, and here, my life's not working out. Things aren't working out for me. Why aren't they working out better? And listen, maybe you are doing things right. Maybe you have been at it for a while. But you also need to remember, for 5 years you didn't. And the consequences of those years, they don't just magically go away because you asked God to forgive you or you just started coming to church. If we sow irresponsibility for 5 years and then decide to become a Christian, the principle still holds. You reap what you sow. But doesn't God love me? Yes, He loves you. Of course He loves you. And He's so loving, listen to me, He's so loving that He gave you a principle and He told you about it ahead of time. And He made it predictable. He made it so predictable that you could know it works every time. You will know what to expect. That's how gracious your God is. He says to you and He says to me, listen to me, this is how the world works. You don't have to wake up every morning wondering what's going to happen. You don't have to wonder, is it going to float? Is it going to sink? You don't have to pray, God, it floated yesterday. Please don't let it sink tomorrow. You won't have to pray that prayer. The principle works the same every day. Whatever you sow, you are going to reap. And the principle not only works that way, it works the other way as well. See, it can work against you, but it'll also work for you. Because remember, the nature of a principle, we said this earlier. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not a right-wrong thing. And listen, this is not about whether you're going to heaven or not. This is something else. It's just a thing. It is what it is. And we don't get to control it. And whenever the sowing is done, and it's time to do the reaping, let me clue you in on a couple secrets that you have to remember. Here's what you'll always find is true. When it's time to reap what you've sown, you'll always find that the reaping comes later and greater than you think it ought to be. I'll say that again. The reaping is always later, and it's almost always greater than you think it ought to be. Let me explain that to you. The consequences, or the payback, it'll always come into your life later than you expect it to come. And see, this is why you and I are so tempted. We want to give up too soon whenever we're doing things right, don't we? See, we think to ourselves, well, I've been at this for 5 months. I've been doing right for 5 months, and things aren't getting any better. I don't think this is worth it anymore. Listen to me. Of course it's worth it. Of course it's worth it. But you just need to remember, you sowed 5 years in the other direction. It ain't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while. And I know what happens. You see other people, and they're in their life, they're sowing all kinds of negative stuff. They're sowing all kinds of bad stuff, and they're not facing any consequences. And you're right, they're not. And here's what happens. You're going to start envying irresponsible people. And you're going to feel like you want to give up. That's why Paul says, don't compare yourselves. Don't look at the one side or the other. Don't compare yourself to other people. That whole reaping thing, it's going to happen, but it's probably going to happen later down the road than you think it ought to be. Here's the other thing. The reaping always is greater than you want it to be. See, again, I said this before. The principle's not fair. There's not like this one-to-one correlation between sowing and reaping, positive and negative every single time. It's not like it's balanced. I'll give you an example. The punishment that I give to my kids whenever they do something wrong, they never think is fair. They always think that the punishment is greater than the crime. In fact, I do that intentionally, and I'll tell you why. And every good parent does this. You always do what you think your kids always think it's unfair because you know that that's how it is in the real world. And I'm trying to prepare them for the real world, and the consequences are almost always greater than what you think they ought to be for the crime you committed. Let's think of it this way. Let's imagine for a second that you're lying in bed one night and somebody decides to break into your house, and they intend to harm you and your family. They break a window, they get into the house, and their intention is to hurt you. You wake up and you spook them, and for whatever reason they decide to run out the door, so they leave. You catch them on the way out, or you see the license plate on the way out, you write it down, you call the police, you tell them somebody broke into my house, here's who they are, here's what they look like, go after them. And they do. And they run them down, and about 30 minutes later, they catch them. Crime is over, right? The criminal goes before the judge, and the judge looks at the case and says, okay, let's look at the crime you committed. The crime took you about 30 minutes to commit, so let's be fair. 30 minutes in jail. What would you say? You'd say, wait a minute, that's not right. And the judge said, oh, okay, well, let's double it. An hour in jail. The crime only took 30 minutes. And you think, no way, 30 days. No, how about 30 years? That's fair. See, you think that a 30-minute crime ought to be punished by 30 years or more in jail. You think that's fair. I'll bet you the criminal doesn't think it's fair. See, here's my point. Our responsibility or our irresponsibility always follows us. It always pays us back every time. And it always comes later than you think it should. And it will always pay you back greater than you think it ought to. But listen, whatever you do, don't blame God for that. Don't blame God because you don't think it's fair. God gave you this principle. He put it in place long before you were here. And God's not stupid. He's not going to be mocked. He's not going to be fooled. He's not going to be manipulated. So, now many of you are thinking, okay, all right, fine. That's not very good news. What am I supposed to do about that? Well, I'll tell you what I think you ought to do. If you're someone here today and you would look at your life and you would say to yourself, you know what, my life is not what it ought to be. My life's not where I would like it to be. Here's the truth, and this is hard to hear, but it is true. You probably sowed your way into that life. You probably sowed your way into it. Now, is it fair? No. Is it proportional to the things that you did when you sowed and now you're reaping? No, I get that. Probably not. But remember, the principle's not fair. It's irrelevant now. But you probably sowed your way in some way, sowed your way into this life. So the truth about it is, you're going to have to sow your way out. And here's how you do it. Remember last week, Ed talked to us about an exercise. He said, the best way to take responsibility is to draw a circle. Remember, he said it's like a pie. And he said the circle or the pie represents all the chaos in your life, all the problems in your job, all the chaos in your marriage, all the trouble you're having with your addiction, all the problems everything that's chaotic in your life is represented in this circle. So you draw that circle, and then you get real honest, and you look at it, and you say, you know what? Not all of that's my fault, but some of it is. And you just draw a little piece. Whatever piece it is, you draw a piece of that pie and say, not all this is my fault, but I own this piece. This piece is my responsibility. You just ask yourself that question. Which slice of this pie do I own? And I know this is tough, and I know this won't be easy, but when you do that, here's what you have to say. Many of us are going to have to say this week. You're going to have to draw that pie and say, this is my piece, and say this to yourself. You know what? I don't like what's happening with my kids. I don't like the way they're acting. I don't like the way that they've turned out. And the truth is, I wasn't that bad of a parent. I did the best I could. And I don't deserve everything that I'm seeing today. But you know what? I own this part. I did check out emotionally for a time. Or I did work just a little bit too much. And maybe that's my piece. That's the piece I can own. Or maybe you need to say this. You need to say, you know what, I know my husband's not fully plugged in at home. I know my husband works too much. He's not affectionate towards me, and our marriage is not what it ought to be. But I own one piece. I did allow the kids to have too much of a priority in my life, and I did not focus on our relationship as much as I should have. And I may not deserve everything that's in this piece, or this pie, but I own this piece. I had this part in it. Or maybe you could say, the bank, they weren't very honest with us. They tricked us. They encouraged us to take out this loan, and we couldn't afford it, and we didn't realize at the time, and it was not fair. But I did sign. I did buy the house, and I do own that piece. Or maybe you say, it's not all my fault, and I don't deserve the way this guy I'm dating is treating me and the way that he's doing in our relationship. But you know what? I did call him back. I did agree to the relationship. That's my piece. Or you could say, I don't know exactly how we got into this big financial mess, and it's way more than we deserve. But you know what? We did misuse credit cards from time to time. We didn't do all that we could have done. We didn't save as much as we could have, and we own this piece. Listen, the only way that you can ever leverage the principle of sowing and reaping to your advantage is to take your slice of the pie and own it. And then you begin to work on that one piece. You begin to ask yourself, where is it that my responsibility began? Where did my irresponsibility start? And you just own that part. And you stop excusing it. You stop looking around and comparing it to what other people have. And you begin to carry your own load, whether it's the big piece of the pie or it's a very small slice. That's your first step. Here's your second step. Whenever you've owned your part, just start doing things the way you ought to have been doing them all along. Start doing things the way you should have done all along. I want you to see how Paul ends this passage, verse 9. Look at what he says. He says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap, there it is, a harvest if we don't give up. See, here's what I found in this whole principle of sowing and reaping. Just like we tend to reap chaos worse than we think we deserve as a result of us being irresponsible earlier in life, the truth is, in due time, you will also reap the rewards of your responsibility. And when you do, a lot of times, they also will be bigger than you think they ought to be. They'll be more than you think you deserve. But the key is this: you can't give up. You can't grow weary. You can't look around. You can't compare yourself to what somebody else is doing and how they're sowing or reaping or whatever. It takes time. And listen, I know it's not fair, and every situation is different, but the promise is still true. Don't get tired. Don't get weary when you're doing good. In time, it will pay off. Listen, it won't happen as fast as you want it to happen. It might come way later than you'd hoped, but the principle still holds. You will reap whatever you sow. So today, on the back of your connection card, if you guys want to grab that today, I want to encourage you to take some of these next steps that we provided for you today. Maybe today, you just need to say, you know what, this week I need to do that exercise. I need to spend some time drawing the chaos in my life and deciding what part of it I own. And you need to decide what slice of that chaos you're responsible for. Maybe you could take that first step and say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to figure out what part I own, and I'm going to start taking responsibility for the part that I created. You could decide to take the next step and say, no, once I figure out what that is, I'm going to start doing things the way I should have done them all along. I'm going to put a plan in place. Maybe now is the time for you to put your plan in motion and sow your way out of where you are into the place that you want to be. Even though it may take a while, you need to start the plan today. Or maybe, listen, maybe you're already doing that. Maybe you've been at it for quite a while and you've been after this plan of trying to sow your way out of a bad situation, and it feels like it's just not turning around and you wonder if it will. Maybe today's your day to say, you know what? I can't grow weary. I got to keep at it because it will come, just maybe later than I thought. And maybe today's your day to say, I won't grow weary in doing good. I'm going to commit to not give up. Listen, whatever step you take, check that box on the back of your connection card. The reason we do this around here, if you're new, is so that, not so we can hound you about it or anything like that. We want to pray for you, and that's what we'll do. We'll pray for whatever God has called you to do. And as you begin to take responsibility, we'll begin to pray that that principle will show itself to be true in your life. Why don't you bow with me and I'll pray. God, I'm thankful that you love us so much that you basically made things predictable so that we didn't have to guess. And God, that whatever we sow, we'll reap. And God, I pray for those here today who maybe have been tempted to feel as if you had abandoned them or you don't love them because of some situations in their life. And God, it's not about your love. God, maybe we're facing some consequences that we didn't ask for and we didn't plan on, and quite honestly, they're just not fair. But God, I pray that that will not cause us to grow weary in doing good. That God, we will begin to sow the things that we want to see in our lives, and God, that you would bless that. And God, you would lead us toward that outcome, and you would show that principle to be true, that you are there with us and you're guiding us and that you love us. And we pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.